the Rock'n'Roll Unravelled Show. I'm Derek Shelmadine. Welcome to another Rock'n'Roll Unravelled Show. Now, two bands stand out when it comes to the breeding ground for UK blues-based groups of the mid-1960s, and that's Alexis Korner's Blues Incorporated and John Mayall's Bluesbreakers. And if we take a look at some of the musicians who effectively sort of served an apprenticeship there, and many of these went on to form some of the biggest bands in the rock and roll history. Well, we'll start with some early background. Alexis Korner. Now, he was born on the 19th of April 1928 in Paris, France, and settled in the UK in 1939. And by 1949, he was with Chris Barber in Chris Barber's amateur jazz band. And in 1954, we can find him in Ken Collier's Jazzmen, and that he was in the skiffle group there. Now, skiffle groups were often part of trad jazz bands, traditional jazz, and this is where the musicians, well, some of the musicians, changed their instruments at the interval and played as the interval skiffle group. This is when the other guys were relaxing in the bar between sets. And the famous example of this, of course, would be Lonnie Donegan's skiffle group. He was the interval group for Chris Barber's jazz band. And in the summer of '54, Ken Collier released the album Back to the Delta, and it had 3 skiffle tracks on it, and that was billed as Ken Collier's skiffle group, and Alexis Korner, of course, was part of that. Now, interesting, this one. There are 2 versions of the album, the UK version, American version. The skiffle tracks are the same on both, but the 6 jazz band tracks were re-recorded with a different band, some different musicians, so that's one well worth tracking down. And in 1956, Alexis Korner was with Beryl Bryden's backroom skiffle. She was another stalwart of the skiffle era, and they released a single, Casey Jones. Now, that featured, as well as Alexis Korner, Cyril Davis, so that famous relationship is now coming together. Now, at the time, Cyril Davis was running the Thursday night London Skiffle Club at the Roundhouse, and in early '57 he teamed up with Alexis Korner, and he wanted to change the focus from skiffle to R&B, and they changed the name of the club to the London Blues and Battle House Club. Now, the Battle House part was inspired by Johnny Otis's club. He opened a club called the Battle House Club in LA in 1948, and that's accredited with being the first club dedicated to R&B. Well, in early 1957, they recorded Blues from the Roundhouse, and that was credited to Alexis Korner's breakdown group, featuring Cyril Davis, where the name is misspelt on the sleeve. It was a 10-inch album, and only 99 copies were pressed originally. And that's guitarist Alexis Korner and harmonica player Cyril Davis, and that's their first recording together as a group, and that album's one of the early milestones in British blues. In 1961, Alexis Korner and Cyril Davis were with the Chris Barber Jazz Band as the Interval Blues Group. Now, Chris Barber had put together a blues group to back his wife, singer Ottilie Patterson, and on the 17th of March 1962, Alexis Korner's Blues Incorporated famously played at the Ealing Rhythm and Blues Club, and that's often referred to as the Blues Incorporated debut gig. And for that gig, they were certainly billed as, and I quote, Britain's first rhythm and blues band. Musicians that night included Cyril Davis on harmonica, Dick Hexel Smith. Now, his name pops up all over the place in this era. He was a great saxophonist, and Charlie Watts was the drummer. He, of course, went on to the Rolling Stones. And Art Wood, the vocalist, well, he formed the mid-1960s cult band, the Art Woods. And for our first piece of music, this was a single from Muddy Waters in 1957, but this is Alexis Korner's Blues Incorporated with their take on Got My Mojo Working. Well, let's take a look at where John Mayall started out. He was born on the 29th of November 1933 in Macclesfield in Cheshire, and he grew up listening to jazz and blues. He taught himself to play the piano, the guitar, the harmonica. And in 1956 he formed his own group, the Powerhouse Four. That was a sort of art school band in Manchester. And in 1962 he joined the Blues Syndicate, another Manchester band. Now there's a great CD that captures some live recordings of these two bands, and it's a CD called Time Capsule, released in 2000. The Powerhouse 4 recordings were from 1957, recorded at Manchester Art College, and as well as John Mayall you've got Peter Ward on drums, and the Blues Syndicate recordings come from 1962. They were recorded in the Rex Ballroom in Wilmslow. And the artists on there, as well as Mayall, include Hughie Flint as the drummer. Well, it was early 1963 that John Mayall moved to London and formed the Bluesbreakers. And their first album was a live recording made on the 7th of December 1964 at Cluck's Cleek Club. That's in Hampstead, northwest London, and the album's simply called John Mayall Plays John Mayall. And the lineup on that includes, as well as Mayall, Roger Dean on guitar, Hughie Flint on drums, John McVie, bass, and Nigel Stranger saxophone. Well, one of the most famous albums must be the Bluesbreakers with Eric Clapton, released in the summer of 1966. And that lineup was Mayall and Clapton, and Hughie Flint and John McVie. It was released around about the same time that Eric Clapton left to form Cream. The album was produced by Mike Vernon, and on it there's a version of Memphis Slim's Stepping Out. He wrote and released in 1959, but this is the John Mayall and the Bluesbreakers with Eric Clapton version of Stepping Out. You're listening to Derek Shelmerdine and the Rock'n'Roll Unravelled Show. We're looking at some bands with their roots firmly placed in two of the Godfathers of British Blues. That's Alexis Korner's Blues Incorporated and John Mayall's Bluesbreakers. But before continuing with the story, there's an opportunity to win a signed copy of my book, Rock'n'Roll Unravelled. Just check out the link to the competition on my homepage. A simple question, and you're in the draw for a signed copy. Now, the book tells a story of rock and roll unravelled from its roots to mid-1970s punk. A record collector liked it, and they described the book as comprehensive and invaluable. Well, good luck with the competition, and meanwhile, back at the plot. Well, we're going back to Alexis Korner, and before becoming arguably the second biggest band in rock and roll history, with the exception of Bill Wyman, all of the Rolling Stones played with Alexis Korner in his Blues Incorporated. Charlie Watts was Blues Incorporated's original drummer. He was there until August of 1962, when he was replaced by Ginger Baker, who of course went off to Cream. Now, Brian Jones is very definitely the founding member of the Rolling Stones. Now, he moved to London in sort of 61-62. He'd already met Alexis Korner when he was playing in his hometown in Cheltenham. And Brian Jones initially stayed with Alexis Korner when he moved to London, and he regularly played with Blues Incorporated. Now, at that time, he was calling himself Elmo Lewis, and he got the name from Elmo, his guitar hero, Elmore James, and Lewis was actually his own first name, and that's Lewis Brian Hopkin Jones. On the 7th of April 62, Mick and Keith met Brian and Charlie for the first time. Brian and Charlie were both playing with Blues Incorporated at London's Ealing Club, and the vocalist that night was none other than Paul Pond. Well, he changed his name to Paul Jones and became the lead singer of Manfred Mann. Now, not only did Mick and Keith meet Brian that night, but they both went on to perform regularly with Blues Incorporated, particularly Mick. In fact, there's a photograph from May 1962 that shows a lineup of Blues Incorporated. And the photo shows Dave Stevens on piano, Dick Hexelsmith on sax, Alexis on guitar, Jack Bruce on upright bass, he went off to Cream, Mick Jagger on vocals and Cyril Davis harmonica. In early 62, Brian decided to form his own group. Now, Brian is very much the founding member of the Rolling Stones. And in that first lineup, he had Brian Knight and Jeff Bradford. But by mid-62, they decided to form their own group, and they left to form Blues by Six. Now, interestingly enough, in the August of 62, Charlie Watts left Blues Incorporated to join Brian Knight in Blues by Six. Now, this left a hole in Brian Jones's lineup, and he filled that, of course, with Mick Jagger and Keith Richard. And the band name, well, that came from a Muddy Waters single called Rolling Stone. Now, it was the 12th of July 62 when the band played its first gig as the Rolling Stones, no G, at the Marquee in London. And the lineup for that historic performance was Mick, Keith and Brian, with Ian Stewart. Now, he was the pianist, and he'd been in Brian's first lineup before Mick and Keith joined. And Dick Taylor on bass. Now, he was the founding member of the Pretty Things. Dick Taylor had been with Mick and Keith in their previous band, Little Boy Blue and the Blue Boys. Now, the jury's out on who was on the drum stool that night. Some people say it was the future Kinks drummer, Mick Avery. Others suggest it was more likely that it was their regular drummer at the time, Tony Chapman. Now, the Stones released their eponymous debut album in the UK in 1964. One of the tracks on the album is Get Your Kicks On, Route 66. Written by Bob Troop, the original version was released by the King Cole Trio in 1946, and that's actually Nat King Cole. Chuck Berry covered the song in 1961 on his album New Jukebox Hits, but this is the Rolling Stones with their take on Get Your Kicks On, Route 66. You're listening to Derek Shelmerdine and the Rock'n'Roll Unravelled Show. We're looking at some bands with their roots firmly placed in those godfathers of British blues, Alexis Korner's Blues Incorporated and John Mayall's Bluesbreakers. Now, lots of bands and artists mentioned in the show actually have concert dates in the diary. And to see the latest tour information for dates and venues, check out my website, rock'n'rollunravelled.com. And at the top you'll see something called 1960s, 70s Artists Touring Now. And you can see which of your favourite artists from the 60s and 70s have gigs booked, tours planned. Well, back to the story. And this time it's back to John Mayall and a look at Fleetwood Mac's links to John Mayall's Bluesbreakers. Well, Eric Clapton played his first gig with the Bluesbreakers after he left the Yardbirds, and this was the early part of April 1965, and the rhythm section was John McVie on bass and Huey Flint on drums. Shortly after that, in the summer, he actually left the Bluesbreakers for the first time and formed a band called the Glands and took off for his ill-fated trip to Europe. In the November, Peter Green joined the Bluesbreakers, and the rhythm section had changed slightly. Huey Flint was still drummer, but John McVie had been replaced by Jack Bruce. He temporarily moved on. Now, Peter Green was only with the Bluesbreakers for about a week, and Eric Clapton came back from his Greek jaunt and went back into the Bluesbreakers. And in the July of '66, John Mayall released his much respected Bluesbreakers with Eric Clapton album. And that's about the same time that Eric Clapton left again, and this time it was to form Cream. And when Eric Clapton left, Peter Green rejoined John Mayall for the second time and became the Bluesbreakers' new permanent guitarist. In the February of 1967, they released an album called Hard Road, produced by Mike Vernon, and the lineup then was John Mayall and Peter Green, and also John McVie. He's returned to the Bluesbreakers, but on drums now, Huey Fleet had moved on, and Ainsley Dunbar was occupying the drum seat. Mick Fleetwood was in John Mayall's Bluesbreakers for about 3 months in the early part of 1967. In fact, there's a John Mayall's Bluesbreakers album called Live in 1967. It's actually a bootleg album, recorded at 5 gigs between February and May of 67. And that lineup was with John Mayall, Peter Green, Mick Fleetwood and John McVie, the future Fleetwood Mac lineup, obviously without Mayall. And that lineup existed for about 3 months, and then Mick Fleetwood was replaced by Keith Hartley. John Mayall heard about this bootleg tape that had been recorded, and he actually restored the tape and sanctioned an official release, and that was released in 2015. Pete Green played his last gig with John Mayall in mid-June 1967, and he was replaced in the Bluesbreakers by Mick Taylor, who was the guy that went on to replace Brian Jones in the Rolling Stones a couple of years later. Now, Peter Green was looking around for a new guitarist for a band he was putting together. Producer Mike Vernon suggested to Peter Green that he should check out 19-year-old guitarist Jeremy Spencer, which Pete Green duly did. And on the 13th of August 1967, Peter Green's Fleetwood Mac made their debut at Windsor Jazz and Blues Festival, and the lineup was Peter Green, guitar, Jeremy Spencer guitar, Mick Fleetwood drums, and on bass, Bob Brunning. Now, John McVie, of course, was the first choice for the bass position, but he was reluctant to leave the security of John Mayall's Bluesbreakers. But Bob Brunning's innings was very brief with the band, and shortly afterwards John McVie joined. And of course the name Fleetwood Mac, well, it comes from the two of them, Mick Fleetwood and John McVie. And our next piece of music's from their second album, Mr. Wonderful, still with guitarist Pete Green, and this is Fleetwood Mac, Lazy Poker Blues. Cyril Davis parted company with Alexis Korner's Blues Incorporated in the November of 62. He was more of a blues purist, and he decided to go off and form his own band, the Rhythm and Blues All-Stars. And one of his co-founding members was Carlo Little, the drummer. There's a lovely little story about Carlo Little. Apparently on the 25th of June 1962, Screaming Lord Sutch and the Savages were playing a gig at Wembley Town Hall, and Carlo Little was the drummer. And he was approached by Keith Moon for some drum lessons. Keith Moon, of course, went on to become The Who's drummer. Jimmy Page, future Led Zeppelin lead guitarist, was the original guitarist with Cyril Davis, but his stay was very brief. He'd previously been with Neil Christian and the Crusaders, but there's another interesting Led Zeppelin connection as well. In the September of 68, Robert Plant, lead vocalist with Zeppelin, he recorded Operator and Steal Away with Alexis Korner. So many links in all these early blues stories. In mid-62, Alexis Korner's Blues Incorporated recorded the album R&B from the Marquee, and the lineup there included Long John Baldry. Now, in late 62, Long John decided to move on, and he joined the Horace Silver Quintet, and they went off to do a short tour of Germany. And when he came back, Cyril Davis had split from Alexis Korner, so Long John Baldry had a choice of which band to join, Blues Incorporated or the R&B All-Stars, and he chose the All-Stars. Long John Baldry's first gig with them came on the 3rd of January 63, at the beginning of the Thursday night residency they had at the Marquee. And who should support them that night but the Rolling Stones? Well, sadly, Cyril Davis died on the 7th of January 64, and he played his last gig at the Marquee just a few days earlier on the 2nd of January. And Long John Baldry took over leadership of the band, and for the next 4 or 5 gigs through to the end of January, they continued to play the residency as the Rhythm and Blues All-Stars. And on the 6th of February, they played the first gig at the Marquee after they'd rebranded to Long John Baldry and the Hoochie Coochie Men. And shortly after that, they were joined by, at that time, an unknown Rod Stewart. Well, this is Cyril Davis and his Rhythm and Blues All-Stars with a wonderful Country Line special. Now, Free was another band to have strong connections with Alexis Korner. On the 19th of April 68, Free played their first gig, sort of gum rehearsal, at the Nag's Head in Battersea, London. And that was Alexis Korner's birthday bash. Now, he'd actually personally known most of them and actually introduced them to each other, and was very much responsible for the Free lineup coming together. And that Free lineup was Simon Kirke on drums, guitarist Paul Kossoff, singer Paul Rogers, and bass player Andy Fraser. Alexis Korner also helped them choose the name, and he suggested that they use one of his previous band's names, and he had a band called Free at Last, so they chopped that down a little bit and became Free. And Alexis Korner became a really big champion of Free. Now, Andy Fraser joined Free after a brief stay with John Mayall's Bluesbreakers, and it was actually Alexis Korner who introduced Andy Fraser to John Mayall. Another great band from the late 1960s was Colosseum. Now, they played a fusion of progressive rock, jazz and blues, and they very much have their roots in John Mayall's Bluesbreakers. On John Mayall's Bare Wires album from mid-68, the lineup included, along with Mayall, Dick Exel-Smith, sax, John Heisman on drums, Tony Reeves on bass, and Mick Taylor on guitar. And Mick Taylor was the guy that replaced Peter Green as the regular guitarist in the Bluesbreakers, and he also, as I mentioned before, went on to replace Brian Jones in the Rolling Stones. But after the Bluesbreakers' Bare Wires album, John Heisman, Dick Exel-Smith and Tony Reeves moved on, and they formed Colosseum. Now, in mid-1966, John Heisman had joined the Graham Bond organisation to replace Ginger Baker when he left to form Cream. And on the 3rd of January 1969, Colosseum played one of their earliest gigs at the Marquee in London, and the lineup was John Heisman drums, Dick Exel-Smith sax, Tony Reeves bass, Dave Greenslade on keyboards. Now, Dave Greenslade had a great pedigree. He came from Chris Farlow and the Thunderbirds and the wonderful Gino Washington and the Ram Jam Band. Now, Dick Exel-Smith has been popping up all through this story, and he was very much a pioneering figure in the early 1960s British blues boom. And he played in all three of the iconic British blues bands of the time, Alexis Korner's Blues Incorporated, John Mayall's Bluesbreakers, and also the Graham Bond organisation. And after Colosseum 1 folded, Dave Greenslade and Tony Reeves went on to form Greenslade. Now, Colosseum's support band at that gig on the 3rd of January was a band called Earth, and shortly afterwards they changed their name to Black Sabbath and became very much pioneers of the heavy metal sound. And from that first Colosseum album, Those Who Are About to Die Salute You. This is the title track, Those About to Die. The last band I'm going to take a look at is the awesome Cream, and they've got their roots in both Alexis Korner's Blues Incorporated and John Mayall's Bluesbreakers. Jack Bruce joined Blues Incorporated around the May of '62. He was followed in the August by Ginger Baker. He'd replaced Charlie Watts when Watts left to join Blues by Six. In the November, Graham Bond joined Blues Incorporated, and he played sax and organ. And the February of 1963, Ginger Baker, Jack Bruce, along with Graham Bond, all left Blues Incorporated to form the Graham Bond Trio. Now, they'd been moonlighting as the Graham Bond Trio while they were in Blues Incorporated, but there's a great urban myth that suggests that Graham Bond told Alexis that the three of them were leaving, without ever having told Bruce and Baker that they were parting company. And then the lineup extended, and the Graham Bond Trio became the Graham Bond organisation. Now, it was around the September of '65 that Jack Bruce left the Graham Bond organisation, and there's another great urban myth around this. Apparently Jack Bruce was sacked after several arguments with Ginger Baker, but he continued to turn up for gigs until Ginger Baker allegedly pulled a knife on him and said, "If you show up again," and leave the rest to your imagination. Well, shortly after that, Jack Bruce played his first gig with John Mayall's Bluesbreakers, and he was in the band, Bluesbreakers, when Eric Clapton returned from his sojourn in Greece. But he moved on shortly after, and Jack Bruce was with Manfred Mann briefly, and he cut the single Pretty Flamingo while he was there. Cream played their first official gig on the 31st of July 66, and that was at the 6th National Jazz and Blues Festival in Windsor, and they appeared on the third and final day alongside people like Georgie Fame, The Action and Alan Bown. Well, Cream was formed by Eric Clapton from John Mayall's Bluesbreakers, Ginger Baker from Graham Bond Organisation and Jack Bruce from Manfred Mann. That's it. I've been Derek Shelmadine. You've been listening to the Rock'n'Roll Unravelled Show. We've been looking at some bands with their roots firmly placed in Alexis Korner's Blues Incorporated and John Mayall's Bluesbreakers, the Godfathers of British Blues. I hope you've enjoyed listening to the show half as much as I've been putting the whole thing together. If you're into social media, you can find me on Twitter at RNR Unravelled and Facebook at Rock'n'Roll Unravelled. Remember, you can win a copy of my book. Good luck with the competition. Join me again next time for another look at some rock and roll unravelled. Well, to play us out, a true blues classic. It started out as Roll and Tumble Blues, written and recorded by Hambone Willie Newburn in 1929. Robert Johnson reworked it in 1936 as If I Had Possession Over Judgment Day, and Muddy Waters took it into Rollin' and Tumblin' in 1950, covered by a host of people. But we're going to listen to the Cream's live version with some awesome harmonica. This is Cream, Rollin' and Tumblin'.